Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Okay, so I was honestly really not looking forward to writing the review of this one, because it feels like I'm reviewing two separate books. A Study in Scarlet is the first of the Sherlock Holmes stories. We follow Watson, freshly back from the war in Afghanistan, who is looking for someone to share a room with. A friend sets him up with an odd fellow who may or may not be a chemistry student named Sherlock Holmes. But when Scotland Yard shows up at their shared rooms to ask for aid, Watson joins Holmes on adventure to a murder scene. The body of a man has been found in an empty room in an empty house surrounded by blood, but with not a mark on him. Of course, the police have no idea what could have happened. Sherlock seems to know pretty much immediately what's going on, but catching the criminal will involve more than just a quick look around. And here's the thing. Yes, that's the basic premise of a good portion of this book, but there's also around 50 pages of what I can only describe as a completely separate book smack dab in the middle of this book. And I knew it was there. I had heard other people mention it and talk about it, but I was still thrown for a loop when I'm in the middle of a Victorian mystery novel and suddenly, nope, we're in a Western. Welcome to the American Southwest. And I can't really talk about why this appears here without major spoilers, but all you really need to know is, yes, this makes sense. Yes, it actually does, fit what's going on. And yeah, the motivation and the conclusion of the book are heavily tied into this random other segment. But I will say, I sort of hated it. Westerns are not my thing by any stretch of the imagination. I've just never been that interested in shoot-'em-up cowboys, and Westerns always make me feel that way. And the biggest thing here is I cannot get over the fake patina of sexism and racism that seems to be baked into the genre. I'm sure there are Westerns out there that don't include any sexism or racism or deconstruct it in an interesting manner, but so much of the genre feels like it's built into the tropes. Even the best of them, the ones that feature really cool and humanized female and indigenous characters, still feels like they are somehow special examples of those categories. That they are the exception to the rule. And that, by its very nature, means the majority of women are shrinking violets who must needs be saved. And the majority of the Indians are savage. And yeah, even here, where I will say the versions we see are exceptions. We don't actually see any Native American doing horrific things. We just hear a reference to it. And we don't actually see any women going, "Woe is me, someone save me." But still, our female character that we see a good bit of is supposed to be this badass girl who's raised in the prairies, knows how to ride a horse really well, is strong and bold, and still has to be rescued multiple times by every male around her, and ends up without agency, sacrificed in the names of everyone else's motivation. And I'm just like, this is my least favorite part about reading classics. There is so much good in a lot of classic literature. There's a reason people are still reading this stuff 100 years after they were written. But it always takes wading through a bucket of bullshit. There's always a little faint patina of the sexism, a little bit of wow, that's misogyny, or wow, that's racism, or wow, we haven't believed that in 100 years. And most of the time, the thing about classics, what makes them classics, is the fact that there's enough good that it's worth it to wade through all that stuff. And, the main storyline here definitely does have hints here and there of blatant racism. There are a few phrases that we certainly would not use now. There's a couple of implications dropped in the text that you're going, oh, I hope you don't mean that. And let's not even begin to talk about British imperialism in relation to the war in Afghanistan. And there's no avoiding the treatment of Mormons in this book. But overall, most of it is not so in your face in the sections that we're in London. But the bits that we're in America, yeah, it's just constant. There's, like, almost every page a reference to the savage people who live out in the woods who are going to eat us, and how the things to fear in the West are the beasts and the Indians. And it's just like, can we not? Could we skip it? And then there's the fact that it's just 100% more setting description than I have ever wanted in a book. Like, we are objectively talking about a 50-page short story, and almost every bit of it, every other page, there's another description of what things look like. And I get it, for the audience that this was written for, the American Southwest was exotic and unknown. They needed more description because they had not seen it, nor anything really like it. And this story does have some rather fun poetic descriptions, but there's just so much of it. And, like, literally page after page of the mountains looked like this, the boulders looked like that, the air felt like this. Like, the objective story that's told in those, I think, 5 chapters could have easily been condensed down to maybe 4 pages if you just cut out even half of the description, no, more than half, if you cut out the majority of the description. And I was just bored. I will be completely honest here. It bored the shit out of me. I ended up skimming huge sections of it. And I know I was hella depressed right when I got to reading that segment, which is going to affect my ability to enjoy things. But I know it was the book, not me, because as soon as I got back to London, my mood had not improved in the least, but suddenly I was enjoying myself reading again the way that I had been before we went off to America. And I really feel like all of that section could have easily been summarized in the confession, or at very least cut down to 1 chapter random flashback. And I kept wondering, did Doyle just want to write a Western and couldn't sell it to anyone, so he just sort of, like, you know, shoehorned it into the middle of a mystery novel? Like, why? Why is it here? But all of that sidetrack aside, I really enjoyed this. I made a short talking about the relationship between Watson and Sherlock, and that is the majority of what really drew me in here. I'm not primarily a mystery reader. They're not like something that I'm like, ooh, I enjoy them, but I don't search them out. And the short that I made was mainly a joke, which a couple of the comments did not get that I was mostly joking there, guys. But I do see why the internet loves to ship Sherlock and Watson. Watson is obsessed with Holmes from moment 1. He is in awe of the man. And the man came into his life right at the moment when he was intensely lonely, in ill health, and at loose ends. There's not much emotion in general in Sherlock Holmes stories. Like, that's part of the draw of these, that you get the fun of solving a murder mystery without the intense pain associated with actual death and characters that matter. Like, a lot of mystery novels, a lot of mystery stories are sort of divorced from those big emotions. And yeah, this one is exceptionally so. I mean, it's Victorian, it's going to be. But the emotions actually are there. They're just more restrained, more subtle, and frankly, more Victorian. And reading between the lines here, and it does take a little bit of reading between the lines, Watson was desperately lonely, unmoored, and lost when Sherlock appears in his life. And here's this figure who's intense, highly focused, and fascinating, and gives him a purpose of recording these stories that otherwise might be unknown, and humanity may never know the miracles of the human mind if he was not going to write them down. And so, yeah, there's going to be an intense relationship between these two, whether it be romantic, sexual, asexual. That doesn't even really matter. It's fun to imagine them as, you know, love interests, but what matters is that they feel intense, or Watson feels intense emotion towards Sherlock, and in these early books, not so much with Sherlock. Now, before anyone reads into that, do I literally think he feels romantic attraction to Sherlock? No, there's no sign that he's bisexual. There is signs that he's attracted to women, or at least willing to fall in love with women, and we don't have enough evidence of what their relationship really looks like, because outside of the cases, we don't see them much, especially not in this story. At the end of this story, they've only known each other for maybe a couple of months, but you can already see how intensely their lives will end up entangled, and you can already see the power dynamics at play. And I love the way Sherlock Holmes is introduced in this story. It is a damn bold choice that before we even meet Sherlock Holmes, another character is telling Watson, and us, by way of Watson, that Sherlock is a bit of an asshole. He's difficult, he's cold and analytical. He cares more about the fact that if he solves this murder, the kudos will go to the police, than he cares about the fact that someone is dead. One of the more moments of direct emotion, one of the moments that emotion is directly addressed in this story, is in the London, or at least in the London section, because there is actually a lot of emotion in the Western section. It's just, whatever. But there's this moment when they are first entering the room with the body, and Watson has this internal monologue about the weight of death on the air, the fact that the mere presence of a dead human being changes everything about the place where it is, and how heavy it is, and you can feel that weight of mourning, and you can feel the fact that he's remembering the war, and he has that weight of trauma on him, and there's just a lot of subtle feeling going on there. But Sherlock himself's completely unaffected. Sherlock treats it all like a puzzle. He has the empathy of a brick. And in contrast, our murderer, our antagonist, and no, I'm not going to tell you who he is, even though whatever. But the antagonist here is the one with the most emotions going on in the story, the ones with the most emotional connections to what's happening, the one who seems to care the most, which does make sense. But he is set up as this really sympathetic character, especially in contrast to Sherlock. And the framing of the two characters is so contrastily different, it's dramatic. Sherlock, we are introduced to him with another character telling us that he's a bit difficult, he's cold, we may not like him. Whereas our antagonist, we're introduced to him being told that he is heroic and kind and desperately, feeling emotions. And it's an interesting twist because it's so clear that Doyle wanted us to feel more for the murderer than he did want us to feel for the detective. And I know that later on in his life, Doyle grew to hate writing Sherlock Holmes stories, tried to kill the character off multiple, or at least once. And I almost wonder if he never actually intended Holmes to be a hero, if he wanted him to be a one-off figure in someone else's story. Which leads me to another one of the elements that I really thought had been made up by modern adaptations, and I hadn't realized really is in the source material. Sherlock and Watson's relationship, whatever it be, is really honestly unhealthy. And the seeds of this incredibly uneven power dynamic are built into the very first interactions with the characters. Sherlock clearly just wants an audience, and Watson is devoted to him. And it's a fascinating, and the innate power dynamics are ones that, you don't usually see in your heroes. And it's, like I said, in the very first interaction we see them have, Sherlock immediately takes charge of this conversation, makes all the decisions, steers the conversation like he's the captain of a ship, and like he has every right in the world to do so. And Watson just sort of smiles and goes along with it. And it's such a strong scene for character development. And it's the stuff like that that really makes me feel like that's why people still read these. These are intensely interesting characters. Now, the plot, honestly, it's not anything that special to me. Yeah, it's interesting, but the mystery story was clearly not written with the intention of the reader being able to guess who done it. If anything, our mystery for the reader is trying to guess how Sherlock figured this out, what clues are important, and how the hell did he get from point A to point B. To the point that, spoiler alert, if you are trying to follow along and guess who the murderer is, you have no chance because the killer's not even introduced to us before he's arrested. We don't know who the hell this man is, which is why we need a complete other short story shoehorned in to introduce the characters who are going to actually matter to the case. We aren't meant to figure it out. That's not the goal here. We are just meant to sit back with Watson and be in awe at the abilities of the human mind. And I do love the fact that Sherlock clearly believes that everyone can do what he does, if only we cared enough to focus, learn the hundreds of similar accounts, and think in the right way. Like, it's clear that he thinks what he's doing is perfectly normal. And I'd always sort of imagined that Doyle sided with Holmes. Like, I've read a couple of other Sherlock Holmes stories before, and I got the vibes from them that he himself, as the author, was saying, yeah, no, anyone can do this if you just, like, you know, study and pay attention. But reading this one, I don't think he actually does think that. I think he does realize that Holmes is doing something, you know, that nobody else can do. I also think, even though, of course, he would not have known the diagnosis back then, I do think he was painting a portrait of someone who is autistic, and therefore does have a mind that does not work the way everyone else's does. If for no other reason than that Sherlock Holmes clearly has special interests which narrow his field of knowledge so precisely. Like, he knows the details of a case that happened 100 years ago that nobody else had even heard of, but he doesn't know the Earth orbits the sun. And this makes him actually a lot more human and a lot more believable because I know who they're trying to write about. Also makes the whole modern trend of autistic detectives a little bit clearly coming from a source material. But otherwise, like, this isn't a big book, so I don't have that much to say about it. I really enjoyed reading it, even when I was in an absolutely terrible mood, with the exception of the Western section. I find Doyle's writing intensely readable, and that was the first thing I noticed the first time I ever read a Sherlock Holmes story. The fact that it read with the smooth readability of modern writing. It doesn't have the purple heaviness of most Victorian books, like actually Victorian, not just set in the Victorian era. Like, it does to me read a little bit more like someone is writing in the modern era and just setting it in the Victorian era than the other way around. So yeah, if you've ever been interested in reading classics and don't know where to start, I do think the Sherlock Holmes stories are a great place to start. And this one is fine. I think it's a great start. It's fun. You get to know a lot about the characters that I did not get to know in later stories. But honestly, maybe skip the flashback unless you really like Westerns.